March 7, 1945, the Rhine, time just past noon. The gray waters of Germany's last great natural barrier slide past the town of Remagen. Indifferent to the death throes of the Reich on its western bank, from the blasted high ground of the Eifel Mountains, a thin screen of American reconnaissance squints. Through field glasses, they see something that intelligence briefings assured them did not exist, spanning the churning river between the vine-patched slopes of the Erpeler. Lay and the ruins of Remagen, the Ludendorff Bridge still stands, a lattice of steel. Against the winter sky, it is a structure built by Russian prisoners in another war, named for a general who prophesied defeat. On its western approach, German engineers scramble, their hands trembling over demolition boxes. On its eastern flank, a train sits, loaded with wounded, waiting to flee. The Americans have been told the bridge would be dust before they ever saw it, but there it is, 325 meters of steel and timber, the last remaining crossing on the Rhine, and in the mud beside the road, a young lieutenant from Colorado, Carl Timmerman, receives his orders. The words are simple: get your men across. To understand the weight of that moment, the sight of the Ludendorff Bridge still standing, one must first understand the river. The Rhine is not merely a geographical feature, it is a psychological wall. For millennia, it has marked the boundary of empires, the frontier of Roman ambition, and the threshold of the German soul. By the winter of 1945, it had become the Third Reich's last desperate moat. Behind it lay the industrial heart of the Ruhr, the political womb of the Nazi Party, and the road to Berlin. As long as the Rhine held, the war had a chance to drag into the summer, if it was crossed in force. The end would be measured in weeks. The Allies had spent the bloody winter of 1944-45 clawing their way to this riverbank. In December, the Ardennes forest had erupted with Hitler's last gamble, the Battle of the Bulge, a surprise thrust that gutted the best of Germany's remaining panzer divisions, but failed to split the Allied lines. By the end of January, the Western Front had stabilized, but the cost was staggering. The Wehrmacht had expended irreplaceable men and armor in the snows of Bastonia, leaving the defense of the fatherland to boys from the Hitler Youth and old men from the Volkssturm, supported by skeletal regular divisions. The Allies, bloodied but resupplied, regrouped for the final push. The strategic plan for crossing the Rhine bore the signature of Field Marshal Sir Bernard Montgomery. Monty, the architect of El Alamein, was a man who believed in set piece battles, operations so meticulously planned that failure became mathematically impossible. His plan, codenamed Operation Plunder, called for a massive assault in the north near Wessel, supported by the largest airborne drop in history, Operation Varsity. It was to be the main event, the thunderclap that would crack open Germany. Further south, the American 1st and 3rd Armies under General Omar Bradley were assigned supporting role, what Bradley bitterly called an aggressive defense. They were to clear the west bank of the Rhine, but they were not, under the original design, to be the ones who breached the river. Montgomery would have the glory, he would have the headline. But there was a flaw in Monty's geometry. The plan assumed that by the time the Allies reached the Rhine, every bridge from Switzerland to the Netherlands would be rubble. The Germans understood the strategic value of their own river. Since the autumn of 1944, Hitler had issued a series of fanatical orders. The bridges were to be held at all costs, but they were to be destroyed at the very last second, denying the enemy crossing while preserving the option for a future German counterattack. It was a paradox that placed impossible pressure on local commanders. If they blew the bridge too soon, they were cowards who had surrendered a strategic asset. If they blew it too late, they handed the enemy a highway into the Reich. The penalty for failure was not a court-martial, it was a firing squad. By the first week of March 1945, the American First Army, under the steady command of Courtney Hodges, had crashed through the Siegfried Line and was racing toward the Rhine. The German Army Group B, commanded by the aging but capable Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, was in retreat. As the Americans approached the river, they heard the expected sounds of demolition. One by one, the great bridges of the Rhine, at Cologne, at Bonn, at Dusseldorf, were blown sky-high, their steel skeletons plunging Into the gray water, the retreating Germans were meticulous. They left nothing useful behind. Remagen was an unlikely place for a miracle. The town itself was old, founded by the Romans 2,000 years prior, but it held no strategic priority for the Allied planners. The roads leading to it were narrow, winding through the steep ravines of the Our Valley. On the eastern bank, the Erpeler lay rose like a fortress, a cliff face of volcanic rock that overlooked the crossing. If a bridgehead were established there, the Germans could, in theory, pour fire down from those heights and turn the eastern shore into a kill zone. The planners in SHAEF, Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, had looked at Remagen and crossed it off the list. It was a tactical dead end. But the Germans had not counted on the Americans' speed. The 9th Armored Division, a unit that had been bloodied in the Bulge and rebuilt with fresh resolve, was driving hard. For the Rhine, leading the charge was Combat Command B, under the command of Brigadier General William Hoge. Hoge was an engineer by trade, a man who understood bridges not just as tactical objects, but as living structures of steel and stone. His task was simple: reach the river, silence any resistance on the west bank, and then wait for Montgomery's grand crossing in the north. No one told Hoge that waiting would be the hardest part. On the German side of the river, confusion reigned. The LXXIV Corps, responsible for the sector around Remagen, was a shell of its former self. Its divisions had been chewed up in the Huerchen Forest and the Bulge. The men retreating toward the Ludendorff Bridge were not the supermen of 1940. They were exhausted, wounded, and demoralized. In command of the bridge garrison was Captain Willy Brach, a 31-year-old officer with a security company of 36 men, a mix of convalescents, clerks, and Volkssturm militiamen. They were not combat troops. They were caretakers whose primary duty was to press the detonator when the Americans appeared. The bridge itself was a relic, built between 1916 and 1919 to rush troops to the western front. It was named after General Erich Ludendorff, a military zealot who saw the war as a test of national will. The structure was a double-track railway bridge, 325 meters long, with 2 massive stone towers on each bank, designed to house machine gun nests. Beneath its deck, the engineers had built cavities in the stone piers, chambers, specifically designed to hold demolition charges. It was a bridge built for war, and it was designed to die. In 1938, the Germans had updated the demolition system. They installed 60 inclined boxes filled with 3.66 kilograms of explosives each, attached to key structural points. The charges were connected by electrical cables, protected by steel piping, to a control panel inside the railway tunnel on the eastern bank. A backup system of primer cord was also laid, allowing for manual ignition. In theory, the bridge could be vaporized in seconds. In practice, the system had been compromised. In October 1944, an American bomb had accidentally detonated the demolition charges on the Mulheim Bridge in Cologne, destroying it prematurely. Hitler, in a fit of paranoia, decreed that henceforth bridges could only be blown by written order, and only when the enemy was within effective small arms range. The explosives on many bridges, including the Ludendorff, were removed from their chambers and stored nearby to prevent an accidental detonation from Allied bombs. The bridge at Remagen was intact, but the means to destroy it had been taken out of the holes and placed in boxes. As the morning of March 7 wore on, Captain Brach watched the western horizon. The sound of American artillery grew closer. He had requested 600 kilograms of military-grade explosives to ensure the bridge could be destroyed quickly. What he received just that morning was 300 kilograms of Donarit, a civilian-grade ammonium nitrate explosive used in mining, far weaker than the military compound he needed. It was all the quartermasters could spare. He looked at the charges, looked at the bridge, and hoped it would be enough. On the other side of the river, Lieutenant Karl Timmermann of the 27th Armored Infantry Battalion was receiving a very different set of orders. His company had just crested a hill and seen the impossible: the bridge still standing, still intact, with German vehicles crawling across it like ants on a log. Timmermann, the son of a German immigrant, knew what the Rhine meant. He had been born in Germany, had left as a boy, and was now returning as an invader. He stared at the bridge, and he knew that history had just tapped him on the shoulder. For Karl Timmerman, the bridge was not just steel and stone, it was a mirror, born in Frankfurt am Main in 1922. He had emigrated to the United States as a child, the son of a German-American who had served in the U.S. Army during World War I. Now, at 22, he was a lieutenant in the U.S. Army, leading men toward the river of his birth. When he saw the Ludendorff Bridge still standing, he felt not just the thrill of opportunity, but the weight of personal history. He later recalled that his first thought was of his father, who had crossed the Rhine in a different uniform, in a different war. Timmerman was a soldier's soldier, tall, lean, and soft-spoken, but he carried the burden of knowing that if he pushed his men across that bridge, many might not make it to the other side. When Major Murray Devers asked him, "Do you think you can get your company across?" Timmerman hesitated. "Well, we can try it, sir." Devers nodded. "Go ahead." The hesitation vanished. There was only the bridge, the fire, and the far bank. On the eastern bank, Captain Willie Bratch watched the American tanks emerge from the tree line and felt his stomach turn. He had the detonator, he had the charges, but he did not have the faith, the Donnerit explosive, packed into the steel boxes on the bridges. Girders was a miner's tool, not a soldier's weapon. It was designed to crack rock, not sever steel. When Bratch's engineers twisted the handle at 3:20 p.m., the circuit sparked, but the explosion was a dull thud, not a cataclysm. Smoke billowed, timber splintered, but the main trusses held. The bridge shuddered, lifted slightly from its bearings, and then settled back onto its piers. The Americans kept coming. A corporal named Anton Faust volunteered to run onto the bridge and ignite the backup primer cord manually. He sprinted through small arms fire, lit the fuse, and ran back. The second explosion was louder, but again, the Donnerit lacked the force to cut the steel. The bridge stood. Bratch, watching from the tunnel entrance, knew that his war was over. He was now a prisoner in waiting. Sergeant Alexander Drabick was a butcher from Holland, Ohio. He was tall, lanky, and 34 years old, old enough to be a father to some of the boys he led. When Timmerman gave the order to cross, Drabick did not hesitate. He later described the run as the longest of his life. "We ran across that bridge hollering, 'Let's get the hell across before it blows.'" The deck was a mess of twisted metal, exposed girders, and gaping holes where the planks had been blown away. Machine gun fire from the eastern tower chewed at the steel beside him. He did not stop. He did not look back. He simply ran, his boots pounding against the ties, his eyes fixed on the dark mouth of the tunnel on the far side. He was the first American soldier to set foot on the eastern bank of the Rhine since the Napoleonic Wars. When asked later about the valor of that moment, he shrugged. "I just wanted to get across. The only thing I was afraid of was that damn bridge blowing up." 500 kilometers away, in the Führerbunker in Berlin, Adolf Hitler was not in a forgiving mood when news arrived that the Ludendorff Bridge had been captured. Intact, his reaction was volcanic. He did not see the structural flaws in the Donnerit, nor the impossible pressure placed on local commanders. He saw treason. He saw cowardice. Within days, a kangaroo court-martial was convened. 5 officers were tried in absentia or captured: Major Hans Scheller, Lieutenant Karl-Heinz Peters, Major Herbert Strobel, Major August Kraft, and Captain Willie Bratch. Bratch was lucky. He was already an American prisoner, safe from Nazi justice. The others were not. Scheller, Strobel, and Kraft were taken to a clearing in the Westerwald forest, shot in the back of the neck and buried in shallow graves. The message was clear: the bridge was worth more than their lives. For the German High Command, Remagen was not just a tactical disaster, it was a moral wound that exposed the rot in the Nazi system of command. The perspective of the engineers, defusing the bomb. While Drabick and Timmerman ran across the top of the bridge, a different kind of battle was being waged beneath their feet. Lieutenant John Mitchell, a 22-year-old engineer from Pittsburgh, crawled onto the girders with wire cutters and a prayer. The German demolition charges were still there, some 2,700 kilograms of Donnerit and military explosives, some with fuses burning, others with failed detonators. Mitchell and his men worked frantically, cutting wires, kicking charges off the bridge, and tossing them into the Rhine. One engineer later recalled the sight of Mitchell standing fully exposed on the catwalk, snipping wires while machine gun rounds pinged off the steel. Around him, he's the one who saved the bridge, Drabick later said. He made the whole thing possible. By nightfall, the engineers had cleared the remaining explosives. The bridge was not just captured, it was safe, at least for the moment. The perspective of high command, Eisenhower's dilemma. At Supreme Headquarters, General Dwight D. Eisenhower faced a choice: his operations. Chief General Harold Pinky Bull argued that Remagen was a distraction. "You're not going anywhere down there," Bull told Bradley. "It's in the wrong place. It doesn't fit the plan." Bradley, usually measured, shot back. "What the hell do you want us to do? Pull back and blow it up?" Eisenhower, the supreme strategist, understood that war rarely follows the plan. He overruled his own staff and authorized the reinforcement of the bridgehead. Within days, 5 divisions were pouring across the Ludendorff Bridge and the pontoon bridges that engineers threw up beside it. Eisenhower later called the bridge worth its weight in gold, but in that moment, his decision was not about gold. It was about instinct. He saw an open door and he walked through it. The first section of the climax is now complete. Please let me know when you are ready for the next part. The afternoon of March 7, 1945, unfolded with the strange, suspended quality of a dream. For the men of the 27th Armored Infantry Battalion, time seemed to stretch and compress simultaneously. At 1:00 p.m., they had crested the ridge and seen the bridge. Standing by 2:00 p.m., they had secured the town of Remagen, pushing through streets littered with abandoned German equipment and white flags fluttering from half-destroyed houses. The civilians who remained huddled in cellars, listening to the rumble of tank treads on cobblestones. The sound was American. On the eastern bank, Captain Bratch watched the American buildup with growing despair. His 36-man security detachment was scattered along the railway tunnel and the eastern tower. Most of them were not soldiers in any real sense. They were men recovering from wounds, men with stomach ailments, men too old to run. He had no artillery support, no armor, and no hope of reinforcement. The only card he held was the detonator. At 3:00 p.m., he gave the order to prepare the bridge for demolition. Engineers checked the circuits, they tested the connections, they reported back the system was live. All it would take was a twist of the handle. At 3:20 p.m., the first American tanks from the 9th Armored Division rolled onto the riverfront. They were M26 Pershings, heavy, new, and lethal. Their 9mm guns traversed toward the eastern bank and opened fire. One round struck a locomotive parked on the far side, causing it to erupt in a plume of steam and smoke. Another round chewed into the stone tower, sending shards of rock flying. The German machine gunners in the tower ducked, then resumed firing. The air filled with the crack of rifles and the thump of grenades. Bratch watched the Americans fan out along the west bank. He saw infantrymen dart from cover to cover, advancing toward the bridge ramp. He saw the barrels of the Pershings swing toward his position. He knew the moment had come. He turned to his engineers and gave the order. The handle was twisted. The circuit closed. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, a series of dull thuds echoed across the river. Smoke and dust billowed from the bridge deck, obscuring the steelwork. Timmerman, watching from a courtyard near the west approach, felt his heart stop. He was certain the bridge was gone, but as the smoke cleared, he saw it. The bridge was still there. The deck was torn up in places. A few girders were twisted, but the main structure, the massive steel arches that held the weight, remained intact. The Donnerritt had failed. A German corporal, Anton Faust, grabbed a torch and ran onto the bridge. He had been ordered to ignite the backup primer cord manually. He dodged between the ties, sparks flying from the steel as American bullets struck around him. He reached the fuse, lit it, and ran back. A few seconds later, a second explosion ripped through the bridge. This one was louder, more violent. Timmerman saw a section of the deck lift and then settle back down, but again the main arches held. The bridge was damaged, but it was still standing. Timmerman did not wait for orders. He turned to his men and shouted, "Get going. Get across." He later admitted that he had no idea if the bridge would collapse under their weight or if the Germans had one more explosion waiting, but he knew that hesitation would cost everything. At 3:50 p.m., Sergeant Drabick led the first squad onto the bridge. They ran in a low crouch, their boots clattering against the damaged deck, the German machine guns in. The eastern tower opened up, sending rounds whining off the steel. Drabick kept running. Behind him, more infantrymen poured onto the bridge, spreading out to return fire. Lieutenant Emmett Burrows led his platoon onto the span, his men firing from the hip as they ran. On the eastern bank, Bratch watched the Americans come. He saw their figures growing larger, their faces becoming distinct. He heard the shouts of his own men calling for orders. He had no orders to give. He turned to the soldiers inside the tunnel and told them to prepare to surrender. There was no point in dying for a bridge that was already lost. Drabick reached the eastern tower at 4:00 p.m. exactly. He was the first American across. He pressed himself against the stone wall, gasping for breath, and then turned to wave the others forward. Behind him, the bridge was a river of olive drab, hundreds of men pouring across the span, their faces flushed with adrenaline and fear. Timmerman crossed a few minutes later, becoming the first American officer to set foot on the eastern bank. He looked up at the cliffs of the Erpeler Lay and realized that the bridgehead was barely a toehold, but it was a toehold on German soil east of the Rhine. The impossible had happened. The first night was the hardest. As darkness fell over the Rhine, the Americans huddled in shallow depressions on the eastern bank, listening to the sounds of German activity in the distance. The bridge behind them groaned under the weight of reinforcements. Trucks, half-tracks, and more infantry pouring across the damaged span. Engineers worked through the night, repairing the deck, removing debris, and shoring up weakened girders. By dawn on March 8, the 9th Armored Division had established bridgehead 2 miles deep and 1 mile wide. It was not much, but it was enough. On the German side, the reaction was frantic. Field Marshal von Rundstedt, commanding the Western Front, understood immediately that Remagen was a catastrophe. He ordered every available unit to rush to the bridgehead and contain it, but the units he needed were either non-existent or already committed elsewhere. He scraped together motley collection of anti-aircraft batteries, training schools, and replacement battalions, anything that could carry a rifle. By March 9, the Germans had assembled a hodgepodge force of 8,000 men, but they lacked coordination, heavy weapons, and support. The Luftwaffe, once the terror of Europe, could muster only a handful of sorties against the bridge. Hitler, seething with rage, ordered the bridge to be destroyed by any means necessary. The Luftwaffe responded with dive bombers, obsolete Stukas that screamed down on the bridge in suicide runs. American anti-aircraft gunners ringed the west bank, throwing up curtains of flak so dense that the sky turned black with smoke. One by one, the Stukas plunged into the river, their pilots buying death for a bridge that would not fall. The Germans tried floating mines, releasing them upstream in the hope that they would drift into the piers. American engineers caught them in nets and detonated them. Harmlessly, they tried long-range artillery, shelling the bridge from positions in the Burgish's land. The shells fell close, but none struck the vital spans. Then came the V-2s. In a last, desperate gamble, the Germans launched 11 ballistic missiles from sites in the Netherlands, the first time the weapon had ever been used against a German target. The rockets struck near the bridge, shaking the ground and terrifying the troops, but their accuracy was abysmal. The nearest impact was 270 meters away. The bridge survived. Inside the bridgehead, the fighting was savage. German counterattacks struck the American lines repeatedly, probing for weak spots. On March 10, a battalion of German paratroopers, some of the last elite troops the Reich possessed, slammed into the American flank. The fighting was hand-to-hand, bayonets and rifle butts in the dark woods east of Erpel. The Americans held, but only just. Reinforcements from the 78th Infantry Division arrived just in time to plug the gap. The bridgehead expanded. By March 12, 6 American divisions were across the Rhine, tanks, trucks, and artillery. Pieces rolled over the Ludendorff Bridge in an endless column. The engineers had built a pontoon bridge beside the damaged railway span, doubling the flow of men and materiel. The bridgehead now stretched 15 miles wide and 8 miles deep. The Germans, despite their desperate counterattacks, could not contain it. The Rhine, the last barrier, had been breached. But the bridge was dying. Every tank that crossed, every explosion that shook its frame, weakened it further. Cracks appeared in the piers. The steel groaned under loads it was never designed to carry. The engineers knew it was only a matter of time. They worked around the clock, shoring, welding, reinforcing, but time was not on their side. On March 17 at 3:00 p.m., the bridge gave up. Without warning, a massive crack ripped through the western pier. The steel arches twisted, groaned, and then collapsed in a roar of tortured metal. The bridge plunged into the Rhine, throwing up a wave that washed over the pontoon bridges downstream. 28 American engineers were on the span when it fell. They were thrown into the icy water, trapped in the wreckage, or crushed by falling steel. 18 of them were never found, their bodies swept away by the current. 93 others were wounded. It was the single bloodiest moment of the Remagen operation. But by then it did not matter. The bridgehead was secure. The Americans had built other crossings. The Rhine was no longer a barrier. When the Ludendorff Bridge collapsed, the war in the West was already lost for Germany. The only question left was, how many more would die before the guns fell silent? The collapse of the Ludendorff Bridge on March 17 killed 28 American engineers and wounded 93 others, a tragic epilogue to a victory that had already been won. But the dead were not the only cost. In the days that followed, the Americans pulled the bodies of their comrades from the Rhine, laying them in temporary graves along the riverbank. The survivors stared at the twisted wreckage and understood that they had cheated death by hours, sometimes minutes. The bridge had held just long enough. On the German side of the lines, the retribution was swift and brutal. Hitler, convinced that the capture of the bridge could only be explained by treason or cowardice, ordered a purge. The 5 officers deemed responsible for the failure were hunted down. Major Hans Scheller, who had arrived at the bridge on March 7 and found himself in an impossible command situation, was arrested, tried, and shot in a forest near Wiesbaden. On March 14, 3 days before the bridge collapsed, Major August Kraft, the engineer officer responsible for demolitions, suffered the same fate. Major Herbert Strobel was executed on March 18. Lieutenant Karl-Heinz Peters was shot on March 21. Captain Willie Bratner, safely in American captivity, was sentenced to death in absentia. The message was clear. In the dying days of the Third Reich, loyalty meant nothing. Survival meant everything. But the executions did not change the strategic reality. By the time the bridge fell, the Americans had poured 125,000 men, tanks, and thousands of tons of supplies across the Rhine. The 9th Armored Division, the 78th Infantry Division, the 99th Infantry Division. These units and more were now firmly established on the eastern bank, ready to drive into the heart of Germany. The bridgehead they occupied was not just a toehold, it was a springboard. The German High Command scrambled to respond. Field Marshal von Rundstedt, who had warned Hitler repeatedly that the war was lost, was summarily dismissed for the final time. His replacement, Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, arrived from the Italian front with a reputation for defensive brilliance, but even Kesselring could not conjure divisions out of thin air. The German forces facing the Remagen bridgehead were a patchwork of shattered units, old men and boys. They fought with desperation, but desperation is not a strategy. In the weeks that followed, the Americans broke out of the bridgehead with a speed that stunned even their own commanders. The First Army drove east, then swung north, encircling the Ruhr, Germany's industrial heartland. By April 1, 1945, the Ruhr pocket was closed, trapping 300,000 German soldiers in the largest mass surrender in the history of the Western Front. The road to the Elbe was open. The road to Berlin was open, and it had all begun with a single bridge in a small town on a gray March afternoon. Eisenhower, reflecting on the capture, called it one of the great breaks of the war. Bradley more bluntly said, "We had crossed the Rhine, we had cracked the West Wall. And we had done it ahead of schedule, ahead of Montgomery, and ahead of the Germans' ability to stop us." The psychological impact was as profound as the tactical gain. The Rhine had been the symbol of German invincibility since the days of the Roman Empire. Once it was crossed, the spell was broken. The numbers tell the story of the breakthrough. In the 10 days, the Ludendorff Bridge stood American engineers laid 1,600 feet of pontoon bridges across the Rhine. Supplementing the damaged railway span, they operated ferries and assault boats. Around the clock, by March 17, the day the bridge collapsed, more than 50,000 vehicles and 125,000 troops had crossed into the bridgehead. The logistics alone were a triumph of military engineering. But the human cost was not limited to the engineers who died in the collapse. In the fighting to expand the bridgehead, American casualties mounted into the thousands. The 78th Infantry Division, pushing east through the rough terrain of the Westerwald, lost 1,500 men in a single week. The Germans, fighting on their own soil, proved more tenacious than Allied intelligence had predicted. They were not the supermen of 1940, but they were still capable of inflicting pain. On the eastern bank, the war came home to German civilians in ways they had never imagined. The town of Erpel, nestled beneath the cliffs opposite Remagen, was devastated by American artillery and German counter-battery fire. Civilians huddled in cellars and railway tunnels, emerging to find their homes reduced to rubble. The Wehrmacht, in its desperation, commandeered whatever it could find: food, horses, even bicycles, stripping the countryside bare in a futile attempt to stop the American advance. The collapse of the bridge on March 17 was not the end of the story, but it was a punctuation mark. In Berlin, propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels tried to spin the disaster as a moral victory. He announced that the bridge had been destroyed by German heroism, denying the enemy a vital asset, but the lie was too thin. Everyone in the High Command knew that the bridge had fallen of its own accord, weakened by American traffic and German bombs. The only heroism involved had been on the part of the American engineers, who died trying to keep it standing. For the survivors of the 9th Armored Division, Remagen became a badge of honor. They called themselves the Bridge at Remagen Division and wore the image of the span on their unit patches. Timmerman, Drabeck, and Mitchell received the Distinguished Service Cross for their valor. Timmerman's moment of glory was short-lived. He died of cancer in 1951, at the age of 29, having served in Korea and returned home a broken man. But in the memories of his comrades, he remained forever the young lieutenant who led them across the Rhine. The strategic impact of Remagen was immediate and irreversible. Montgomery's Operation Plunder, the long-planned set-piece crossing in the north, finally took place. On March 23, 2 weeks after the Americans had already crossed. By then, Patton's Third Army had also breached the Rhine to the south, using pontoon bridges and assault boats. The grand plan, the meticulous choreography, had been rendered obsolete by single stroke of luck and courage at a bridge that should not have existed. Germany's last line of defense was gone. The war in Europe would end 6 weeks later. On May 8, 1945, the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen is gone now. Its twisted steel was salvaged long ago, cut away and melted down or sold as souvenirs. Only the stone towers remain, two on the west bank, two on the east, standing like ancient sentinels over a river that no longer divides a continent. In one of those towers, a museum displays photographs, letters, and fragments of the bridge. Visitors stand where engineers once cut wires, where soldiers once ran, and they try to imagine the sound of gunfire echoing off the cliffs. But Remagen was never really about the bridge. It was about the moment when the impossible became inevitable. For the Germans, it was the proof that no barrier could save them, that the Reich, for all its boasts of 1,000 years, would crumble in a matter of weeks. For the Americans, it was the vindication of a doctrine that valued speed and initiative over rigid planning. For the men who crossed it, Timmerman, Drabeck, Mitchell, it was simply a job that had to be done, a run across a span of steel. That happened to be the most famous 325 meters of the war. The bridge was built for war, in the middle of one war, and it died in another, just days before the fighting ended. In between, it carried soldiers to the front, refugees to safety, and invaders to victory. It was a structure of iron and stone, but it became a symbol of luck, of courage, of the strange twists of fate that decide the course of history. In the end, the Rhine still flows past Remagen, gray and indifferent, but on its banks the towers remain, and in the silence between the stones, if you listen closely enough, you can still hear the echo of boots on steel, the sound of 90 seconds that changed the world.